Hi there, welcome to Lesson 9 of Theme 5 GCSE Geography. So we're moving on Theme 5 is weather, climate and ecosystems. We've dealt a lot with weather and climate. We're moving on to the final element now, which is ecosystems. And this lesson is going to be a little bit of an overlap because climate links directly to ecosystems. Whatever the climate is directly affects what vegetation can grow there and what animals can live there in that region. So tropical climate, you're going to get very different plants and animals to polar climate in Antarctica or in the Arctic. So climate zones that we've studied so far link very closely with ecosystems that we're moving on to. So this is a little bit of a bridging lesson. So we're going to activate our prior knowledge on the location of the main climate types, the main climate zones that we looked at before. And we're going to revisit the main characteristics of those climate zones, but also add to that the characteristics of their associated ecosystems and explore the links between climate zones and ecosystems. So pause the recording here for a moment. Go ahead and write this main title down in your books, please. Okay, little starter to get us going. If you have a printer at home, then you do have this map on a handout if you want to print it out and stick it in. If you don't have a printer, don't panic too much. As usual, either just leave a little gap or just sort of do this starter mentally for yourselves. This map shows the main climate zones of the world. And as you can see, there's an obscured key there on the left. Underneath each of those little boxes that I've added is the name of the climate zone that matches the region of that colour. On the bottom of the map, you've got the climate zones. Mountain/tundra. I've put both of the terms because sometimes they're referred to as either or of those words. Same applies to tropical/equatorial because it's around the equator. Sometimes it's referred to as equatorial climate. So we've got mountain/tundra, tropical/equatorial, polar, temperate, arid/desert and Mediterranean. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 climate types there, 6 colours. See if you can match the climate type to the correct colour on the key. Excuse my email pinging away in the background there. Right then, so these are our main climate zones. So we've got polar there in the blue. Temperate is the green. That's our type of climate. It exists mostly underneath the jet stream. Arid or sort of desert. Now, arid and desert, when we look at them as ecosystems, are slightly different. Arid is very hot and dry, but not quite as dry for as prolonged periods as desert climate. But for the purpose of this map, you've got arid there in the yellow. Tropical or equatorial around the equator there in the red. Mediterranean, just pretty much mostly just that little patch there around the Mediterranean Sea. There is another little bit here on the west coast of America. And then mountain or tundra climate. So these black patches here, where you've got the Rockies, you've got the Himalayas, you've got the Andes, you've got the Alps. Okay, so that creates mountainous or tundra climate. So obviously, as we know from prior knowledge, these different climate zones have different characteristics attached to them. Polar, cold and dry. Temperate, mild and relatively wet. Arid, hot and dry. Tropical, hot and wet. All right, so obviously that's going to affect the flora and fauna. Flora being vegetation. Fauna being animals. It's going to affect the flora and fauna that can live there. Okay, so we're going to venture into the ecosystem side of things now. An ecosystem, very simply, is anywhere where you have living and non-living things interacting and affecting each other. That can include predator-prey relationships, who eats who. That can include obviously surviving and reproducing. And ecosystems can be any size as long as you have living things and non-living things interacting with each other. So you've got 3 images here. One is of a rainforest, one is of the ocean, and one is of a fish tank. Are these all ecosystems? If you think any of them are not an ecosystem, why not? Just have a little think about it based on what I've told you so far. An ecosystem is an area where living and non-living things interact with each other. Okay, so if we come first to this image of a rainforest, are there living things in the rainforest? Yes. The rainforest is one of those biodiverse areas on the planet. If you remember, biodiversity is the term for the variety of living things. Extremely high biodiversity in a rainforest. You'll find 750 different species of plants per hectare of land. It's home to a quarter of the world's animal species. So you've got lots of living things here. The flora, the vegetation, and the fauna, the animals. What are the non-living elements of a rainforest? What do you find there that is not alive? Soil, rocks, and the weather and climate that influences the area. So a rainforest is an ecosystem because you have living and non-living. So if we come to the second central image there of an ocean, yep, there's living things in an ocean. Your coral, your fish, and so on. What are the non-living elements of the ocean? Yeah, the sand, the rocks, the water itself. And when it comes to so that's definitely an ecosystem. Now, when it comes to a fish tank, is this an ecosystem? What do you think? Are there living things here? Yes, there are. You've got the plants. You can get plastic plants for fish tanks, but usually you've got living plants, you've got living fish, and then you've got your non-living elements. You've got the glass of the fish tank, you've got the gravel in the bottom of the fish tank, you've got usually a thermometer and a heater and a filter, all the things that control the climate and the ecosystem within that fish tank. So ecosystems can be any size. When we're in class in school, that is its own ecosystem, and it changes. If you guys have been in my classroom for a double or a triple, the temperature within the room will have risen because of all of our body heat being in there. So we are affecting the climate in there. Equally, if it gets really hot, then some of us might take jumpers off or whatever, so the climate is affecting us. The crucial thing with an ecosystem is it is a two-way street. Everything affects everything else. The living affects the non-living and the non-living affects the living. All right. So to represent that interrelationship between everything, here is a visualization. So you've got the climate, the vegetation, or the flora, the soil and rocks, and the living creatures, the fauna. Make just a really quick representation of this diagram into your books. The most crucial thing is that all the arrows are double-ended. You don't have to do the little pictures. They're just there for illustration. Just words and arrows is fine. So pause the video here a moment and do that briefly, please. Okay, so some of these arrows are more obvious than others. Obviously, coming this way from climate to vegetation, if the climate is really warm and there's plenty of rainfall, there's going to be lots of vegetation growing. If the climate is too hot and there's not much rainfall, then there's not going to be much vegetation growing. Same if it's too cold. But back the other way might be slightly less obvious unless you remember your water cycle, for example. Plants release moisture in the form of transpiration. Transpiration rises, cools and condenses to create clouds, which create more rain. So vegetation can affect the climate as well as climate affecting the vegetation. Same with soils and rocks. It might not be so obvious how the ground would potentially change the climate, okay? But if you've got lots of really dark soil as a surface, that's going to absorb solar radiation and get very warm and then release that heat to the air, warm air rises, and rising air makes cloud that brings precipitation. So dark soil surface, naturally vegetated soil surfaces tend to create higher precipitation levels. Whereas if you've got an area that's covered in snow, so it's white, that reflects solar radiation and keeps the area much cooler. So the colour of the ground, if you like, whether it's dark soil, natural vegetation or snow, affects the temperature and the precipitation in the area. It's called the albedo effect. So you don't need to know necessarily what the impact of every arrow is and how every arrow works. It's just crucial that you understand that everything here affects everything else. Okay, a couple of new key terms before we go too much further. An ecosystem itself. An ecosystem is a community of animals and plants interacting with their living. The proper term for living things is biotic, and non-living, proper term abiotic, surroundings. For example, an ocean ecosystem or a classroom ecosystem, a fish tank ecosystem. It's the interaction of biotic and abiotic. Okay, the way that I remember the difference between the two, biotic, biology is the study of living things. So biotic is living, abiotic, opposite, non-living. Okay, pause the recording here a moment, put down the term ecosystem and put down its meaning, please. Okay, next term, population. I don't know. I just went with Finding Nemo for the theme here. I don't really know why. Losing the plot in lockdown, perhaps, but I thought it was cheerful. So anyway, a population is the number of organisms of the same species. An organism is a living thing. What's your spelling of that term? It's the number of organisms of the same type, the same species living in an area. So in the case of this image, the number of seagulls in a particular area of the seaside. So pause the video here a moment, put down that key term and definition, please. Okay, the next one is community. Whereas population is the number of the same animal, community is all of the species added up, all of the animals and plants living in an ecosystem. That's your community. Pause the video here a moment and write that one down. Okay, and finally, biome. Now this comes up quite a lot. A biome, it's a very large ecosystem. So the Amazon rainforest, for example, the largest rainforest on the planet, that would be a rainforest biome. The Pacific Ocean, massive ocean, that would be an ocean biome. Okay, so pause the video here a moment and get down the meaning of biome. Okay, so the next thing I'd like you to do, included in the lesson folder, is a document that I think it says something like ecosystem information to fill in the table, or ecosystem resources for filling in table. If you open that document, if you're lucky enough to have a printer and you prefer to work on paper, you can print it out. But if you don't have a printer, don't worry, you can just use the electronic version. There's a resource sheet for each of the 3 ecosystems that we are going to focus on. All right, there were 6 on the original map in the starter. The specification does not need us to do every single one. We're just going to look at 3 contrasting examples. We're going to use savanna grassland, tundra, and tropical or equatorial. In the resource that's in the lesson folder, each of these climate zones / ecosystems has a double-sided sheet of information to accompany it. So there'll be 2 orange sheets for savanna grassland, 2 blue sheets for tundra, and 2 tropical green sheets. If we were in class, I'd have printed them out double-sided, so you'd have 1 double-sided sheet for each one. But of course, if you're using it electronically, it will look like 2 sheets. What I'd like you to do is, using these resources, have a little skim and scan through, pick out the key information and summarize it into this table. All right. The aim is that this table will have summarized information on the main climate characteristics and accompanying ecosystem characteristics. So the stuff in here will only talk about temperature, precipitation, weather, climate. The stuff in here will talk about where do you find the ecosystem that goes with that climate zone, what animals live there, what plants live there, what are some of the main features of the ecosystem that is created in this climate zone. Also in the lesson folder, there is a sheet that says ecosystems, images and maps or something. So you do have these photos if you're able to print them out to create the photo column, just because it looks nicer in your book. If you don't have the ability to print the photos, like I said, as usual, do not worry about it. Option number 1, create a photo column but leave it blank. We can sort it when we get back to school. Option number 2, just cut out the photo column. So use the resource information, summarize the key features of the climate into here, and the ecosystem, the animals and plants and main features of what lives there, into here. I've put a couple of examples in for you so you can get an idea of the type of thing that you're putting in. I do want to see specific facts and figures as well. So in the tropical ecosystem column, I want to know how many plants there are per football pitch worth of land, or how many animals live here, or in the savannah, what kind of animals live there. Give me an example of some of the big cats or some of the other types of plants you might find there. Yeah, try to be specific and use your key terms. Take a whole page turn sideways, give yourself plenty of space. I want to see a minimum of 2 bullet points in every box, preferably more than that, especially in the ecosystem column. This box is not full. There's just 2 there to get you started. I'm expecting to see probably 1 or 2 more at least. Okay, so use these resources. Take a whole page turn sideways, draw out this table, summarize the information into this table. Bullet points and note-taking format is absolutely fine. Pause the video and go ahead and do that, please. Okay, so here's an example of the kind of things that you might have written in there. You may have written more than me. Great. But this is just kind of a bare minimum example of the types of things you might have picked out. Have a quick scan through here, see if there's anything that you've missed, because mine is the main bare bones of what you needed to have picked out. If you've missed anything, add it into your table. If you haven't got room, just put like either a little asterisk, do you know what I mean by that? Just like a little star, and add it on the next page outside of the table, or some kind of numbering link key, or whatever suits you. Okay, and that is the end of lesson 9. We've explored and reminded ourselves of the main climate zones, their location, their main characteristics. Are they hot and dry? Are they hot and wet? Are they cold and dry? And then we've linked that to, well, what can grow there and what can live there. And that's how climate affects ecosystems. So what we're going to move into next lesson is looking more at, within an ecosystem, what goes on to sustain life? Nutrient cycles, water cycles, carbon cycles, mainly focusing on the nutrient cycle. And then following on from that, we'll start looking at specific ecosystems, beginning with tropical rainforests. So as usual, if you have any questions, queries or worries, please drop me an email and I'll get back to you within a couple of days maximum. And I hope you're enjoying so far.